Welcome to the second of the Policy Exchange's new series of podcasts. I'm Michael Mosbacher, and with me today is David Goodhart, who's the founder editor of Prospect magazine and is now head of demography at Policy Exchange. This week, the government has finally published its Levelling Up white paper. Michael Gove published it yesterday, and I'm speaking to David Goodhart. Your reaction to the white paper has been much more sympathetic than many other reactions. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was a pretty good effort. I've been following this story for a while, so it's true. There was nothing very much new in it, and it was always going to be the case that Labour was going to say, "Where's the money?" But I was very impressed. I mean, they are, as I said in the piece, they're like a kind of supergroup team of policy analysts that wrote this: Andy Haldane, Neil O'Brien, and Michael Gove. And they have, I think, comprehensively dealt with the issue of how do you kind of make a reasonable rod for your own back as politicians? You know, how do you stay consistently interested in the subject, over long periods of time? Everybody acknowledges this is a really, really sticky issue. A lot of these disparities, regional inequalities, have been with us for 100 years or more. We have, generation by political generation, spent billions and billions, tens if not hundreds of billions of pounds already to very little effect. And interest in it tends to come and go. And I think their real achievement is creating a kind of political mechanism by which they can be judged. They have their 12 missions, rather grandly named missions. I mean, they're effectively targets. Everything from longevity and obesity to increasing R&D spending in relatively depressed parts of the country. But they don't, not only do they have targets, they have a system including better information systems, better data analysis to know what is happening, and they have an annual appraisal of how much progress or lack of progress they've been making towards the goals. So I think they have handed, as it were, the opposition parties and the media a very good mechanism by which we can keep attention on the subject and follow progress or lack of it towards the successful completion of these 12 missions.
So one of the things the white paper shows is that regional inequalities in the UK are much greater than virtually any comparative country. I think only Poland and Mexico have got equal levels of regional inequality. Do you think the white paper gives a decent explanation of why Britain's in that position? And
I think it does. I mean, it's got I think chapter 1 is quite a deep dive into all of this stuff. I think our situation here is worse, partly because of London. The gap. London is pretty unique. I think the role of Dublin in Ireland actually is relatively similar, but the extent to which there is one kind of all sucking in great metropolitan centre is very unusual. The underperformance of our other major cities is another big factor. And I think one of the factors that perhaps they don't necessarily kind of weave these causes together, but I think one of the big factors here is residential universities. There's a real problem in a lot of the left behind areas with the inability to retain graduates. I think what's the figure? I think half of all graduates from Grimsby, go to university and never return to Grimsby. That will probably be true of lots of other. So lots of places like Grimsby, are losing their brightest kids to London and other big metropolitan centres, and I think that's as it was. And we're an international outlier in the extent of young people that go to residential universities. So I think that has exacerbated a problem. Obviously, one of the big underlying factors is, London and the South East has always been the richest part, pretty well always been the richest part of England and then Britain. Briefly, the Midlands and the North flourished in the industrial age, and then in the post-industrial age, we've kind of returned to the status quo ante. That, as I say, has been exacerbated by our system of sucking out the.
And you make the point that the report sets out a series of targets on 12 areas. You think that creates a structure of accountability that hasn't existed in its place?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think there have been a huge number of initiatives. I mean, money is a factor. I mean, it's a very important factor in we do need to invest more in these areas, and the government has talked about that. Everything from shifting civil servants to Darlington, to investing more in R&D, to investing a huge amount more in public transport systems and so on. I mean, there is money. I mean, the complaint yesterday when the paper came out was there wasn't any new money, or not very much new money. But we have spent probably tens, if not hundreds of billions, to little effect. So the important thing is a structure to keep the focus on, make sure that people don't lose interest in it. And the other factor that will keep the focus on it is is another step forward in the devolution story, giving more power to creating mayor-like bodies in much of the rest of the country. I mean, I think there are lots of criticisms of the way that the mayoral system, the combined mayoral authority system, has worked. But I think, on balance, the record is positive. It is another layer of bureaucracy.
You think having a single figurehead is a good model?
An
elected mayor, or I think there's talk of governors.
And it's if you talk to somebody like Paul Ormerod, who's chair of the Rochdale Development Agency, he will say that, and he's no great fan of Andy Burnham, I don't think, but he will say that the combined authority, the mayoral authority in Manchester, has been a really important has played a convening role that no other body could have played, from the bottom up, as it were, in that part of the country, and that's also the more power there is. The power is still pretty limited. I mean, the Treasury hasn't really given fiscal autonomy to these local bodies, but apart from anything else, they will have a mass, along with opposition parties at the national level and the media, they will be another really important lobby for making sure that we pay attention to these missions and that they are at least.
Would you like to see them have more fiscal autonomy?
Yeah, I mean, the problem, of course, is that if you give people more tax-raising powers, then at a local level, you then have the problem that the poorer parts of the country end up even poorer because their tax base doesn't have the capacity to support whatever the ambitious projects that your mayoral authority wants to fulfil. But you can get around that. I mean, in Germany there's a fair amount of fiscal autonomy, but then there's a sort of equalisation process between different states. So clearly a lot of thought has to be given to that. But and I do think if you want to attract really good people into local and regional government, then you have to give them more power, and power tends to follow the money.
The paper also makes a big thing of pride in place, which has been a sort of interest of policy exchange over the years, and it's been quite a sort of continuum of the work here. But you think that's an important part of the package?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the third sort of original bit. I mean, like I say, there have been lots of initiatives of this kind going back, 50 years at least. I think what is unique about this white paper, what is to be especially welcomed about it, is the combination of these three things: the system of kind of accountability that they've set themselves, the devolution, the further push in devolution, which in a sense is part of that, and the whole pride in place thing. It used to be a little bit of an add-on when people were talking about these issues. I think it's much more central to the way that people are thinking about it now, to do with the kind of emotional aspect of people's feelings about the way that
And what can government do to rejuvenate pride and to boost pride in place?
Well, it can do lots of little things to help people regenerate run down areas of towns and so on. But also I think it's connected to this issue we were just talking about of graduate retention. I mean, if you live in a part of the country where all the bright kids are leaving to the big city the whole time, it kind of makes you feel sort of a second-class citizen. The feeling that actually there's stuff going on here that's worth staying for. I think is a very the first 4 words of the whole report are "stay local, go far." And I think that is a very different way of thinking about this. I mean, all of this, in a sense, is part of a new sort of, perhaps somewhat more social democratic post-Brexit thinking on the part of the Tory party. So we're in kind of sort of interesting new territory here, I think, politically speaking.
Do you think there has been a shift in Tory thinking from a more sort of free market perspective to a more social democratic perspective?
Oh, well, I think it's been going on for quite a long time. I think the Tory party has long since ceased to be a true believing free market party if it ever was. But obviously the big change came after 2016 when the Tory party sort of found itself almost by accident the party that had to implement Brexit, and it then after 2019 found itself as a result of that partly with a big new working class electorate in parts of the Midlands and the North. I mean, it always had a working class electorate to some extent, but that grew substantially, and that then creates a new set of pressures and influences, and how they, as it were, continue to be the party of the kind of southern middle class, while also representing the interests of northern constituencies that have a much bigger vested interest in high levels of public spending and so on, is a big dilemma for the Tory party, and I'm not sure it's one that they've really thought through. I mean, this obviously the levelling up stuff is all on one side of that sort of agenda. It is the more sort of social democratic. That one associates very much with the kind of Brexit, the kind of Cummings-Gove world. I mean, Michael Gove has clearly been on a considerable political journey from being, I think, somewhat on the free market wing of the party some time ago to being much more open to sort of semi-social democratic thinking.
Isn't the other shift that has happened, obviously, from a laissez-faire to a more social democratic party, one can very much overstate how laissez-faire even Thatcher was. But there's been that shift, but there's also been a shift. The Conservative Party historically has been pretty anti-devolution. Thatcher was seen as quite a centralising Prime Minister. Now we've got an agenda which is about devolving power. That's quite a shift in Conservative thinking, isn't it?
I guess it is. But all that centralisation does seem to be in complicated ways associated with the grotesque regional inequality, and I think it does seem to be a necessary, not sufficient, but a necessary condition of rebalancing the boat, that we give more, that the centre gives more power to the regions, like I say, partly to act as a lobby to make sure that these missions are fulfilled.
And that goes back to the accountability point. You're saying this creates a framework of accountability. I suppose the issue there is that most of these targets are very long off. They're 2030 targets. The government isn't going to be in place in 2030. You'll have had at least 2 elections between now and 2030. Does that still mean we've got a proper mechanism of accountability here?
As they quite rightly say, these are very, very long-term structural changes that they're going to try and implement. They're not going to happen overnight. 8 years is not a very long time, and
it's not a long time in Britain's balance shifting. But it's a long term in electoral politics.
It is a long term, but the point is, you can start judging them in a year's time or 2 years' time on the progress that they, 2 years' time, is what a quarter of the way towards the goal. If they've made no progress at all towards these missions in that time, that presumably what the Labour Party has any sense. I think that the Labour Party should have been much more positive about this. Obviously, it's a reasonable enough point to point to the lack of new money, but there are, for all of the projects that the Levelling Up White Paper is talking about, there is a huge, many tens of billions of government money that's already been announced or is in there. It's a reasonable point for them to make, and they will obviously point out the local authority spending is still 50 or 60 billion pounds down on what it was in real terms compared to 2010. But they should embrace this, because Labour has failed on this just as much as the Tories over the last 40 years.
You think this problem dates back to the 60s? Or?
Oh yeah, deindustrialisation was beginning long before 1979. People tend to attribute it all to Margaret Thatcher, but a lot of it was already happening in the 1970s. You look at things like the closure of coal mines. It began in the late 60s. I think more coal mines were closed in the 1970s than even in the 1980s. This goes back a very long time. I do think that like I said, I'm quite very supportive of the white paper, and I think it's a shame in a sense that it's dropping into this political context of heightened cynicism about politics because of the whole Partygate business, and it's being knocked off the front pages almost immediately by the cost of living measures that have been announced today. But I think this will turn out to be really, really important. I think it'll be a huge factor even as soon as the next election. Like I say, that's 2.5 years away. That is a reasonable period of time in that 8-year period for the media, for the opposition parties, for the mayoral authorities and others to sort of to hold the government to account. It's quite a dangerous thing for them. They might come that election. They might find themselves squirming a bit because they have made a rod for their own back. A couple of things I think they might have slightly missed, and not so much in terms of the detail, but more in terms of the narratives. I thought they could have made more of the sort of marriage between levelling up and net zero. I think there is quite a neat story you can tell about how it is precisely those sort of former industrial areas, and many of them still to some extent industrial, that are the most appropriate places to be the centre of the green industrial revolution. Teesside, making the wind turbines and so on and so forth. Even perhaps more day-to-day things like insulating homes. The worst insulated homes tend to be in the poorest areas. Creating a big task force of people. Having a skills boot camp on insulation and.
So you'd like to see more of that, more levelling up.
Well, I just think it's there in the white paper, but I think it could. They could have made more. They could have placed that more centrally to the kind of the narrative that the story they were telling about it, and also because I think a lot of these areas are going to be areas where there's quite a lot of scepticism about net zero. It might be one of the ways actually of kind of marrying the sort of Tesla driving Tory voting person living in Surrey, with somebody living in Middlesbrough who is working on wind turbines. But I think the other thing, there's surprisingly little on the way that the pandemic has opened the door to many more professional people essentially working from home more or less the whole time. Some hybrid working and just more working from home in general. And I think that does open the possibility of sort of spreading
professional,
the kind of affluent professional jobs don't necessarily all have to cluster together in London, Manchester, Leeds, wherever. There was a mention of that, but it was very much in passing.